Nice mug.
Right, good evening everyone and welcome to a very full agenda of the Community and Corporate Overview and Scrutiny Committee. First item of the agenda is apologies for absence. None? Excellent. Minutes of the previous meeting to move the correct record. I believe, Councillor George, you have a...
Yeah, I'd like to propose an amendment to the minutes of the last meeting. So I'll read what the minutes currently say, and then I will provide my what my proposal is. So the minutes currently say it was proposed by Councillor Brunel Walker and seconded by Councillor Evans that this item be deferred as a certain important background documents have been provided to the committee late and they didn't feel they had time to consider them. I'm proposing that it's be changed to, it was proposed by Councillor Brunel Walker and seconded by Councillor Evans that this item be deferred as certain important background documents have been provided to the committee late and there were missing appendices to report, meaning full consideration of the item could not be given.
I'm more than happy to second that. So with that addendum in mind, are we happy to approve the record amended? Was that a question or you voted? Oh, voting. Okay. Thank you. Okay, next item is declarations of interest. Does anyone have any interest to declare in any item on the agenda tonight? Looking around the room, I can't see any hands. Okay, next item, public question time. Are we aware of any questions from the public?
No, there's no public questions or member questions.
Great, thank you very much. In which case then we shall move straight to the first of the two main agenda items. So the medium-term financial plan overview, which is pages 9 to 34. Graham, I believe this is in your hands tonight.
Yeah, just before I start, Imogen, do you want to say some words of introduction?
Sure, yeah, I can do that. Basically, that I realise, as many of you are new to this committee this year, it's important to say that the council annually goes through a budget setting process that all councillors are part of, and you have a responsibility for the public, and you're invited to contribute to this. If you basically all I'm saying is if you don't know what something is, ask. If you don't understand something, please ask again. But the first part of this budget setting process for next year and the different areas we brought to you during the remainder of this year, and you have a real opportunity to question the officers and the executive members and ultimately shape the council's budget for next year. But leaving things right up to the last minute, i.e. in February, is far too late to make significant changes, and honestly getting that far without raising your concerns would be irresponsible to our residents. So the time to contribute and make changes to this is now in the autumn. But the key thing to understand is how we need to fit all of our services into the budget that we have, which is a very limited budget, which usually means some things to be prioritised, especially where it's a legally required statutory service. Usually those things that are non-statutory is where we have more flexibility, but it's also important to find ways to make statutory services more efficient if we can. However, if you think something needs a higher priority, it is in these series of meetings that we're presenting that this needs to be raised. So today we're going to bring you the MTFP summary and shortly our reserves in the next item. But can I ask you to ask the questions and make sure the officers have thought through everything and all of the consequences, suggesting ideas how we can make things better and more efficient? Because that's what scrutiny is all about. I'll leave it with you with that.
Okay, thanks, Imogen. Right, so just by way of moving into this and orientating ourselves, this is the 5th time we've brought these papers, the budget submissions, to overview and scrutiny. And what we've done throughout those years is we've taken comments on board in terms of presentation, information, and indeed adding now another paper around the whole of the council's balances position, which we introduced last year. So it's quite evolutionary in its nature, and this is the 5th iteration, as I said. As Imogen pointed out, there will be a number of councillors around this table who will be new to this, so And I think understanding the kind of the education piece is really important, as well as obviously the inquiry and the challenge, and indeed the suggestions to help this council in an extreme time of financial challenge. And our extreme time of financial challenge is the same as many councils up and down the country. So on though one hand, one might think that because inflation indicators have come down, because maybe the cost of borrowing's come down a little bit, that the pressures have dissipated. That is evidently not the case. And I can say that from my understanding of what's going on the national position, the regional position, and indeed the Berkshire position. The financial challenge resulting in forecast overspending and then creating a gap in future years' budgets is very present in a way this year. Probably might surprise you then even a higher level than it was last year from my conversations with my peers across the country. So that's a really important context. Something else to just alert you in terms of the recommendation, obviously recognise the challenge, recognise it is, of course, seductive to go for easy solutions. And when I say that, go to balances to fix a problem. It doesn't actually fix the problem, it just passports the problem, but it buys time. So I would say balances are for the very rainy day, as long as it is only a day and does stop ultimately, and we can see a time that it will stop. And it's best used when it's spent for investing in prevention, early intervention, all sorts of sound financial choices that stem the tide coming down upstream. So I would be always very supportive of that. And we are in a position, unlike many authorities I know, that can actually have the flexibility to invest in something that does pay back more in terms of its impact on demand management in that early intervention prevention way that I described. So I won't say any more about the specific report. I'll just bring you to, sorry, just one thing is that you'll see in the report it cites a very brief form of consultation. We're looking to be much more diligent and let's say have a much more intensive approach to budget engagement next year, and work with those that we've built up good relationships with in terms of seeking views from partners and beyond, as well as the public. But we will be trying to seek out key thoughts from the public in terms of their desires and expectations, as well as signposting them to this suite of meetings so that they can tune in and obviously pick up the paperwork online. So we're trying to ensure there is a form of public consultation and engagement, albeit it's in many ways a sticking plaster from what we've had last year to doing something much more intensive. Right, okay, moving to Appendix A, then page 16 sets out the dates you hopefully have in your diaries, and you'll see that these will be the specific departmental bids that will come to you. So when I go to the summary, your obvious question will be, well, what's making up all that £40 million or whatever it is? And the answer I will give you is you will find out on the 29th of October or 12th of November. So this is just to make sure you know that all of those detailed bids, both revenue and capital, will be coming to you together by department. So it'll be adult social care, will actually be the care services, adult social care and children's social care will be bringing their capital and revenue bids at the same time. So some of these is just teeing you up for, be ready for, and I also do that in some of the strategic messaging as well. I won't know the very detailed answers, but if you log it and ask the respective director and lead member, then you'll get a much better answer than the more cursory one that I would give you. But I can give it a go if you're really keen to find out. Page 18 is me setting out what I consider to be the strategic external factors, and page 19, the strategic internal factors. The section 114 notice, I think you'll all know that language. That's where an authority is declaring itself to be effectively broke and therefore has to stop all spending because it's depleted all its reserves. It can't find a way out. I'm not for 1 minute suggesting we are in that or on the cusp of that, but as I go on to the reserves later, if things go against us over a period of time, we could land up on the fringes of this. So we can't afford to be casual and slapdash about this. We have to be, we need to recognise we could potentially be in this position if we make a set of bad decisions over a long period of time. And one of those is obviously an overdue call on balances to keep the boat afloat. The local government finance settlement usually comes out just before Christmas, about a week before Christmas. Although the autumn statement at the end of October may point to signals, for example, around what council tax capping may be, for example, or other potential impacts on grant, there will only be sort of from a national perspective. I suspect they won't tell us what Wokingham Borough Council will get in terms of the grant, but obviously if it was a statement around council tax capping, then that would be quite translatable and I could do a calculation on what that would mean. But in terms of money available to local government, it would be almost impossible for me to calculate from something a statement included in the autumn statement. So the finance settlement was important. The current assumption is council tax will be increased, will be capped at 2.99, as in increases, can only go up 2.99, plus, of course, 2% for adult social care. And the funding, well, it is a statement of fact that when we do our calculations in terms of the government grant to Wokingham Borough Council, we are the lowest funded unitary per head of population. It's a really important strategic point that this committee understands and obviously takes beyond if you can, is the fact that we're calculated as the lowest funded and even considered to be funded higher than we should be based on the calculations is, in my view, extremely flawed, because the calculation is massively skewed, if not totally coloured by socio-economic factors which steer money towards deprivation. Now, of course, you could say, well, of course, those authorities that have highest deprivation should have the highest level of money, but it's the number of times higher that some authorities get per head of population compared with us. I've forgotten the figures now, but they, multiples of 7-8 times higher for providing the same services, and it ignores the fact that the cost faced by a council has much to do with factors that are not deprivation led. And if I could give you the best example I could give you is set out in the next paper, which shows that our DSG, Dedicated Schools Grant, which is that deficit, is being driven by our costs in the high needs block, which is special education needs and disabilities. And we are heading for a deficit of in the region of £40 million accumulative deficit. Our funding isn't even the lowest in the country, it's about the second or third lowest in the country. Yeah, and we're doing all that we can under the safety valve programme to do all the right things and put all the right things in place, and they're being validated and signed off. And yet we're heading for £40 million cumulative deficit. That is a beautiful illustration that it is not just factors of deprivation that drive needs. If Matt Pope was here, he'd say the same applies to learning disabilities as well. And also he would say to depleters as well. We suffer very badly by attracting, say, high adult social care provision in private, and then people run out of funds, they become depleters, they fall on the local authority. So I think it's really important for the long-term financial viability of this council to get our message to those in power, particularly for next year's settlement. I believe this year's settlement will be substantially a rollover because there's not a lot of time to do much else. But the following year, beginning spring, there'll be a much more extensive overhaul of the local government regime. And if we don't get our points understood, then we could fall foul of the perceived low needs, high resource, because we have a relatively high dependency on council tax, which is calculated into our resource. And if those two things are the sole factors, then we could find ourselves, with well, I would say shortchanged through the allocation system, which of course would have very severe impacts on what services we provide. Mentioned inflation has dropped, but we still need to be alive to the cost of living, impact on the community, public sector pay award, not yet determined, but you'll be aware that other forms of public sector awards have been given at inflation busting rate. It doesn't necessarily translate to that's what local government officers will be paid, but it's a relevant risk consideration. Internally, and I've deliberately said because it's an obvious place to go, is reduces staffing expenditure. And that's a right and proper question to ask. We should all be trying to reduce our staffing budget. It's also worth noting that since 2003-04, and there were slides later on that are going into more detail about this, that we've taken actually close to £8 million savings out of the staffing budgets, which equates to about 9 or 10%. At a time that the population's getting bigger, the demand's getting bigger, the course. So we're on one level expanding, and then on another level trying to reduce our staff that are delivering this expanding budget. Now, of course, we put growth in for staffing as well. So in some ways, we're getting rid of posts that we think they don't add as much value and then putting it to where they're really in greatest need. So there'll be a bit of that. But the first ask or the first responsibility is find all those staffing reductions you can find responsibly to then address the whole question of how do we make the books balance and deliver in the context of a growing service pressures. And well, just the final point, we actually do have a list of our over 112 major projects of all the things we're going to do. Some might look a bit more business as usual, but some are very ambitious and stretching. So we are an authority that are not dealing with a carefully managed decline. We are actually an authority facing great financial challenge and with high ambition as well to be the best we can be appropriately for our community. I've then set out under adults and children. I won't go into those in any more detail because They will come back when adults and children present their detailed submissions, as will place. But happy if there are questions, and there is one already. Shall I take questions now?
Go ahead.
Just thought I'd ask it now before I forgot it later on. Could you, I know that you said that we're amongst the lowest funded in the country, and therefore a large proportion of our spending power is generated by council tax. Have you got an estimate of how much our spending power will increase if the government grant is what you think the government grant is going to be? So I noted that the council tax would go up 5%. How much do you think the spending power per head will go up?
Right. Well, my initial response was going to be, being as it's pretty much dependent on council tax, then 5%. But then you've got population growth in there,
Yep.
which will then reduce it.
Although
I would,
population growth presumably will also increase the council tax take.
well,
Maybe it is 5%.
although it's got a delayed impact, and you'll notice that the council tax base goes up 1%. Which we've got in our figures. So let's say that they equal each other out. I would go for a headline of, it's got to be the council tax increase is pretty much the increase in core spending power, because the government grant is relatively very small in the core spending power.
Could you just remind us how much the core spending per head is? Or it doesn't matter, you can tell me later if you can't remember.
I'm going to guess £83
83.
per head. Yes, but I need to check that.
Okay, that's it.
From memory, it was it was £83 per head. Was that grant? No, sorry, that was grant.
Not
per
grant.
head. No, I'll have to come back with you on core spending power per head.
The other frustration I've got, Graham, is I think it's the same question as I asked last year, and I looked at last year and compared the figures, and it's very, very difficult to compare the figures because it's all deltas. Now, last year I said the same thing, and you said you'd send us the base figures of the actual base budgets. Would you do that again, please?
Yeah, we actually changed our template to do just that.
Good.
So it shows the initial budget, and then it shows the saving or growth line against that initial budget.
It isn't in here, in page.
Oh no, I didn't realise it was a requirement for the summary position.
It was last year. Because I've got my notes. If you could, that'd be great.
I'll apologies.
That's all right.
I hadn't appreciated that. I'll try and remember it for next year, and we'll get them added as we send updates out.
Thank you. And if you could give us the base budget for the summary, that would be great. Just so that we can see what's going on. Because it's actually very difficult when all you can see is the changes.
So can you, first of all, just to make sure I understand correctly, can you tell me what page you're talking about?
It doesn't have a number.
What agenda?
That one.
Oh.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's the MTFP revenue summary.
Oh, yeah.
Right. So it's page 30.
Yeah. So what I'd like to understand is not just the gaps, but how much the actual base is as well, please. Otherwise, it's really, really difficult to follow. It's even more difficult in capital. You just can't make head and tail of it.
Right. Okay. Well, what I can easily do, maybe something we clarify offline, because I think what you're saying is, in that top line we can show adult social care total budget, chief exec's total budget, etc. The MTFP budget gap. Well, I wouldn't know what to put. Oh, so I could just give you the total by department. Yes, I can do that. That's no problem. Very good spot. Can I just say also that the total departmental budgets will all be presented with the departments. So all of that will come to this committee and was scheduled to come to the committee. I just didn't bring it at the summary time, but you'll get it at the departmental time. I think that was why I thought I'd covered your point, which will be covered.
I actually think, though, it's a sensible point. It would be good to have that top line number in that revenue summary position, just so we can see the base, the growth, the savings, and the gap. Just to add that extra column in for each of those years, as Pauline suggested, I think it would just give some greater visibility of the numbers, not just the growth and the savings. I think if we can have that,
It also gives you an idea of how significant it is.
absolutely, yeah, I'd agree.
Oh, sorry.
No, just saying if we can have that table. I know it's being presented in each of the budget sections as we go through this over the next couple of weeks, but it would be useful to see an updated version of that table that has that information added to it.
Yes, that's fine. Yes.
It's just as a summary. It's otherwise, I agree with Pauline. It's difficult to follow the thread through of some of it, but
Yes. Well, the whole lot will come to about 140 mil. And most of that will be in adults and children. But I'll do that. Yes. So, where was I? I was some way back. So I think, yes. So I was on page 20, the national challenges in care services. Again, this is just to give you the heads up of lines of inquiry for future meetings and place again. Page 22 is dedicated schools grant. I think it's worth stressing. The third bullet point, that is my single biggest concern as your Chief Finance Officer. I think our general fund position, our HRA position, our capital position is in relatively, when I say relative to the national context, good position. ESG, I do not feel the same about at all. That is of immense concern, although unfortunately the answers are not easy.
Pauline.
Yeah, thank you, Graham. I agree. Can you just give us, for those people who haven't been here for a lot of times, can you just give us the position in the DSG in terms of how ring-fenced it is? Because last year I think there was a bit of conversation about how much liability we actually had for this rather than not. And I think there was an indication that we might have more liability than we hoped. And then secondly, talk about what control we have over it, because it feels to me a bit like a blank check, which worries me.
Yes, two very good questions. So the first question is to some extent answered by the second bullet point. So there is currently in place something called a statutory override. And this statutory override is obviously legislation, so it is the law. However, it is only an override in place and currently until March 2026. What this override means is that this accumulated deficit you should not really be too worried about, because it's ring fenced and it sits in this beautiful ring fence and doesn't therefore fall on the council taxpayer in any way. It just accumulates while this statutory override is in place. Once that override stops, and one assumes that an override does not run indefinitely, then all those factors no longer, or factors of assurance, are no longer in place. And so where does it sit? Whose liability is it? And I can't see it's anybody's liability other than the council's, because it sits on the council's balance sheet, albeit was ring fenced as not to worry about, and then all of a sudden it's not ring fenced. I would be staggered if that override was not extended, because it would have a severe, not just a severe impact on us, but imagine all those other local authorities that are just about holding on suddenly have to introduce a deficit, and some have deficits in the several hundreds of millions. So ours is scary at 30 odd. 34.6 end of this year forecast. But others I know, are exceeding 200 million, and that's so that I can't imagine that would just simply be taken away overnight. There's two other really important factors here. Is although on its appearance it's ring fenced and does not fall on the council taxpayer, we know that isn't true for two reasons. One is, you'll see in the summary, we're making a contribution to the DSG deficit, which I really am loath to do on one hand, because it shouldn't be, it was never intended to be a council tax cost. But on the other hand, I don't believe I would be acting responsibly, or indeed we would, from a financial perspective, knowing that this was racking up and we were doing nothing to try to at least mitigate some of it. I'm not suggesting we are even addressing the lion's share of it. The other point, which is really significant as well, is that deficit has to be funded. So we either borrow and pay borrowing costs on that, potentially £40 million, not cheap, borrowing costs, maybe 5%, or we don't have the money to invest, which means we lose 5% on being able to invest through our cash treasury management. Either way, it costs us about 5%. Well, it costs us, yes, about 5% on every £1 million. So we are, the ongoing under the scenes costs of financing this deficit is growing towards £2 million per year, which is on top of the deficit contribution that we're making to the equalisation fund. So it is already, despite being ring fenced and protected, how did I do that? Ring fenced and protected, it's having an impact on this council in quite significant ways already.
So just to follow up on that, I understand why you're paying into it. Is there a risk that lots of other councils with 200 million or whatever in their deficit don't, and then at some point the government decide to write it off, and we end up, as we did with I think some of the council housing that we paid twice for in the end, we end up, because we do what's sensible, we end up getting the sticky end of the argument, which we wouldn't if we hung out and waited.
I completely understand your point, and it's one that I grapple with on a daily basis. But I think the best way of answering your question is, one, I do not believe we have a choice to sit back and wait for the unknown, whenever that may or may not materialise. The other point is that the deficit in our balance sheet around the high needs block with DSG is kept separate from any other forms of contribution. So there's a clear audit trail of our genuine deficit prior to any contribution elsewhere.
Sorry, just one final question, or a couple of final questions. Is anybody else doing this?
Not to my knowledge.
Okay. And then the final thing was, I understand from the CSP board papers that we've actually got a lower percentage of send, which really surprised me, compared to the rest of the southeast. And I just wondered if you'd like to expand on that a bit more. Like it said, spend in Wokingham was 7.2%, while southeast regional average was 11.7%, which was completely the opposite of what I expected. I just wondered if you'd like to give us any thoughts on the financial impact of that.
Well, I don't have the detail, but I do know that it's send that creates the DSG deficit, and it's a statement of fact that it's heading for a £35 million deficit after government grant and funding.
Could that be why ours 40 million rather than 200? I was really surprised that our number was lower. Very surprised.
I don't know. It wouldn't be the reason, I don't think, about ours not being over 200 million, because I think those sizes of deficits will be linked to counties as opposed to unitaries.
Can I make a suggestion that as we go through this tonight, that if there's any items that come up that we want to make sure are covered off in individual budgets as we see them over the next couple of weeks, that we circulate them through Liam to capture? I think there's some in here that we're not going to be able to cover off. I'm not saying that one, but in general, there'll be some questions that come up. And forewarned for the budget means that they can come with some of the answers or that focus to cover off. I think DSG is one of the big ones.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. So that question we captured and make sure when Emma turned up with Prue that they could answer that in a much better way than I could.
Just very quickly, rather than making a contribution towards the DSC deficit recovery, which I actually think is a good idea, it's prudent, it's good accounting, could we potentially put in place a provision that we hold, where we hold funds as a provision against that liability?
Interesting.
As far as I'm concerned, it's effectively the same thing. It's just names of funds, but it's a lot. We hold it, and we're currently use it for where we are undertaking intervention measures. So we have to, onboard some additional resource to do something to try to help reduce that ongoing spend. So it's that early intervention prevention, the upstream. The downstream work in order to prevent the upstream expenditure. So those types of things. But to all intents and purposes, that it is, yes. Great. Okay. So that's the page 22. Page 23. As with capital, there's lots of uncertainty. We don't know what will come out in the settlement, and particularly around certain types of capital grants. Obviously, seal receipts. Trevor might know a few things about this, but obviously that's been funding a large part of our capital programme and our future capital programme in terms of its enormity, because it used to be at about £15 million and then become 250 million pounds. An awful lot of that is because of the strategic development locations, the SIL funding investment. And we've assumed some asset disposal, but they're obviously risky, and interest rates stay high. Page 24 just shows you a picture of the savings over the past 6 years, which, of course, this isn't intended to show you the full picture of the council's finances, but it does. It's a bit like that staff savings one. Of course, you make the savings and then some has to be reinvested elsewhere. But in terms of all the measures to reduce costs, generate income, make savings, then you'll see that it's creeping towards 30% since 2019-20. 30%. So effectively, 30% of the council's budget has been attacked in some way to either disappear altogether or be redistributed elsewhere to meet new growths, new initiatives, etc.
Just touching on workforce, are you ready to touch on workforce, or is that?
Oh, beautiful. Page, yes, 25 starts the workforce piece. Yep.
I would say nice segue.
Another thing that would help me on workforce savings is to understand the actual cost of workforce, the base, because again, savings don't really tell you anything, especially as you said, you're also increasing it using investment elsewhere. And I'm not suggesting you should strip all the workforce out, because that would not be sensible. But I think to see the base headcount cost and would be helpful, so that we can actually see not just the savings, but actually the total budget over the last few years. Well, last year, this year, next year, whatever.
Okay, I don't know whether this answers well, it'll answer part of the question. So if you start with page, only because the maths are easier, but you go to page 28, it says 7.66 million, which equals 10% of the workforce. That's the budget. Therefore, the total workforce budget is about 76.6 million.
Yeah, but it doesn't tell you what you're increasing. So you said yourself that you're decreasing it by savings, but you're also increasing it by new investment. So
Yeah.
it tells you what you're saving, but it doesn't tell you what you're actually spending. So I wouldn't expect. So you're saying that the staffing is 76 million. I am sure it's not going down to 69. So what is it changing to? What was it last year? What is it this year? What will it be next year?
Okay. For 25, 26.
For last year, this year, and next year. So try and get me years in the right place. For 23, 24, 24, 25, and 25, 26. The actual headcount costs.
I think I'd also like to see not just the financial number, but the actual FTE,
Numbers, yeah.
the FTE impact on that as well. In that same summary. So I think to Pauline's point, it's going to be up and down and down. It's not necessarily, we've done this because then there'll be growth in other areas. But I think having that baseline of, what does 7.66 million look like in FTE? What are the nets? What's the base? How does it go? That doesn't need to be done for tonight. But I think when we're starting to look through staffing in general, I'd like to have that level of data added. Sorry. In addition to Pauline's comments as well.
Okay, if I've understood that right, then from 24, 25, what's being requested is the total staffing budget for the council, the FTE over those 3 years.
Yeah, 23, 24, 24, 25, and 25, 26.
Yeah. What I suggest is when we bring the corporate services here, that will be the place to do it because that'll have all the HR stuff.
If we are going to look at the cost, one of the important factor is if, let's suppose there is 5% increase in resources, I'm sure there would have been some additional tasks which would have been taken by certain departments. So to have a complete picture, can we have that so that it would auto justify that if there is increase in case if there is a increase in certain areas. So let's suppose we have 100 people and over 3 years the count increased to 120. So where there is delta, there would be some additional activities or the task which would have been taken by different domains if possible. Then you would have a complete picture. If there is increase, that would be the reason behind that.
Yeah, I completely understand the point. I would say to have that in any great detail would be quite a significant, if not in some cases quite impossible job. The local government is really quite fluid in terms of both the government's responsibilities, so transfer of responsibilities and what have you. So, for example, the Ukraine refugee scheme. Obviously, we didn't have a team administering all that, undertaking the work and support required, but we do now. So that would be one, but that would be an easy one. There'll be loads. So I completely get the point. I guess all I can say is we can try to tease out the more significant ones. Because another thing is, you create shared services and then they're all part of your staff and then you disband those services, you outsource, you insource, have different levels of responsibility, different activities, as you said. So I take your point, and that's an important part of understanding the story. It's just very challenging to unravel that story and do it justice.
I would say, especially I completely agree. I won't expect a very detailed exercise because it would be very resource intensive. So I would not recommend that. It would be something high level kind of stuff. So then you would have a complete picture. So if people see half of the data, half of the truth is more dangerous. So that's why I was recommending if you could add some high level kind of stuff like refugees and those.
Mm.
Can I just double check one shift model? Or are you asking for just a little bit more flesh on the bones? So just more headline numbers that sit beneath the headline numbers, more detail on visibility, or I'm just trying to get my head around the specific ask and then translate that into what Gray can realistically do. Oh, sorry, Pauline, go ahead.
If we have what we had last year, which I think we probably will, we get a complete set of all the investments that each of the areas is planning to do, and it also says what they're planning to save with them. So you'll get that level when you get into the details of each of the budgets. I think that's what you're after.
Well,
Or are you after the history?
I think I know what you want.
I think you got it.
But you can say it better because it's your request.
I was saying if we, let's suppose if we see certain numbers, we need to have a complete picture. So complete picture would be because I don't know whether there is increase in resources, increase in the expenses, if there is a subject to the condition, if there is increase in certain areas, to have a complete picture, not all low level details, but high level, like you mentioned about the activity we started. We didn't have that team looking after. So then you would have a complete picture, 20% increase, but the team was working on these additional tasks to justify, because otherwise we would see why this is like 15% increase. So that's where I was coming from.
Yes, and another good example. I'm not sure it fits in the time frame, but we insourced some staff from Optimus, so that was a change in responsibility. If you went through 3 years worth of growth bids, the answer is it will partially be explained there. But if, say, 10 people have been moved from one activity to focus on, say, the Ukraine refugees scheme, use that example, and the growth wasn't needed, you may not have seen the full debit and credit coming out in that way. It might have been dealt. Well, I'm not even sure. It may not necessarily. If you had 2 staff that was simply repurposed to do new activity, neither was raised as growth or savings. You just did it, then you wouldn't have seen it as. But we try to gross these things up as much as possible. Sometimes practicalities just take over, and you've got 2 staff that just need to be repurposed.
Sorry, just on that, can we perhaps share for the whole committee the last pack as an example of one of them from last year, just so everyone can see the level of detail that we're expecting or will be getting in the future packs over the next couple of weeks? And then if there's something that's glaringly missing, perhaps circulate that back. I think, as Pauline said, there's a lot of information in previous packs from previous years, sorry. So Liam, can I ask if we can I don't think it matters which one, just share the kind of the format of what information is presented. I think that'd be useful for all. And then any questions that come back about gaps, feedback through Liam, and then we can get that through to the Director of Presentations over the next couple of weeks. Everyone happy with that?
Okay, so page 30 is a crucial table, which I understand we will now add the totals for each department to give a bit more context, but it won't change the bottom line issue, which is that despite the fact we started off in February thinking that year 2, which has now become year 1, so when we set the last budget, we thought we had about an £8.8 million gap. Early in the year, that rose to about 12.6, and through all the work done across the council and within the directorates, costs have been managed down, and new, initiatives have been brought into, efficiency initiatives have been brought in, that has actually brought that overall gap that had moved from 8.8 million that we knew up to about 12, and then down to 5.5 million. It's not great to have a 5.5 million pound gap, but given where we are, and both in terms of the national context, the regional context, but also where we are in the budget setting process, we have some way to go. It's not a terrible place to be, but obviously any savings that are taken out or any additional growth that's put in just makes that gap bigger. It is, in the context of the next paper, 5 million, to use reserves to cover £5 million would not be, let's say, moving towards the realms of an unsafe budget. But I would say always using reserves to fund ongoing shortfalls. I would urge that we all do everything we can to avoid it. But it is, thankfully for Wokingham, currently a place we can go. But I stress the word currently. Then the next 3 years set out the costs over and above. So they're cumulative. So year 2 shows there's a further £5 million challenge at this stage. It's on the basis of a big unknown. The big unknown is what the waste contract changes bring. Obviously, these will be reported back to council, potentially through executive, but certainly to council. That was council's resolution. So I don't know exactly what that figure would be. It will be dependent on what's agreed through that process. Obviously, we're going through a very extensive competitive dialogue process, so we need to understand that if we could make that 2.2 million zero, then we significantly reduce our year 2 challenge. And then year 3 challenge, I would look at the year 3 particularly with a bit of caution. Year 3 tends to get a lot bigger the closer you get to it. But at the moment looks quite a modest increase. And you'll see that 5.4 million, if there wasn't, as Pauline rightly pointed out, the 20, is it 23? It's 20, should say 24, 25. It's actually 2 years wrong, isn't it? So it's obviously wasn't corrected in last year. So it would have been there somewhere. Oh, I just said budget gap. Oh, that's the way to go. Yes, we just said MTFP budget gap, like last time. So that basically means 4.7 million came out of balances. So 4.7 million of the ongoing expenditure we funded as a one-off from balances to make it, then it represents itself in the following year. You'll see that if we didn't have that carry forward, we would be near as damn it balance. It would be incredible. However, we do. And I suppose that's, you could say really that top line section of services, the total of net where it comes to 493, it's effectively saying take out those bits below the line which are more kind of corporate wide issues, that the services have more or less brought the whole of the departments to zero, 493k, and actually would have been zero if it wasn't for children's, which is quite common, the big growth area. So I think that's quite a strong testament to the kind of the housekeeping and financial management that's gone on. In terms of 25-26 taken without the legacy brought forward, that's pretty much balanced as it is, which will be an incredible position to be in.
Just before we go to that next slide, Pauline had a question from earlier. Just wanted to wait for a logical stop.
So I'm sure you can explain this quite happily, but looking at last year's, the additional tax base, 1%, 1%, 1%, was projected for this year for 25-26 to be 2.89 million. It's changed to 1.53 million. Why is that?
Was it 24-25?
No, 25-26, as stated last year,
right,
for the 1%, 1%, 1%, was meant to be 2.89 million revenue. Now this year it's showing us 1.53 million.
You sure that's not cumulative?
I don't know.
Year 2. So if you look at year 2 tax base, you would say you're expecting 3.1 million. And I'd say, well, not.
Why do you make it cumulative?
Well, we always have since time began. but I've been here pretty much then. There's always two ways of showing things, a cumulative and a year by year. If you show them year by year, people say, why don't you show them cumulative? If you show them cumulative, they say, why don't you show them year by year?
You answered the question, which is it's cumulative. Thank you. Yeah, thank you. I hate cumulative.
It just takes your head around it. Graham.
Yes, okay. The next page is special items, which are, for those that haven't come across this strange terminology, special items are one-off pieces of revenue. So it's for you need to spend in year to buy a revenue thing, like a bit of consultancy work lasting 5 weeks. A growth is like you're employing member staff indefinitely. So that's the difference. So specials are one-off lumps of money that come from balances because they're just one-off lumps of money. It's okay for them to come from balances. Over the page is the capital, and of course the detail, which will be the meaningful stuff, will come to you as we go through each directorate. So that's the whole £160 million, obviously focusing on the bigger stuff, and you'll see that place and growth have by far and away the most significant. A lot of the resource and assets are permissions to spend as opposed to investment potential opportunities as opposed to actual clear commitments and expectations. So by far and away, place and growth is the the capital version of what adult social care and children's services is on revenue. So if you're looking at revenue, your big stuff's adults and children's. If you're looking at capital, your big stuff's place and growth. But there you are. That sets all out. The great news about this is that the current proposals allow us to have some money set aside, a surplus, which then get immediately used up if we then honour the bids in year 2, and then over the 3-year period we have an overall slight deficit. So it's not bad. I have been in a situation before where I've been presenting big capital deficits or underfunds of 30-40 million pounds. This is actually pretty good. There is no requirement for big slash and burn, but I would strongly urge caution, because although that is positive, it looks like there is some money available. There are risks in there, and there's also the fact that we've got a very big decision to make. When I say we, you, as in executive and council, around the HQ, the future headquarters. Whatever way we go is going to require capital funding. So the more we can kind of just leave, that's just one example. Sometimes we can get other capital emergency issues arise as well. So it's always good to keep some headroom in capital and indeed build up funds where possible. So that would just, I must say.
And just remind everyone that the details of the capital programme come forward in the next couple of weeks as we go through each department's budgets. Pauline, sorry.
Thank you again. Looking at last year's capital spend forecast for 24-25 was 312 million. I'm just wondering what the outturn was or is likely to be at 24-25. Obviously, you can't tell what it is, but we're getting close to the end. Is it likely to be anywhere near the 312? And then the second question is, for year 2, last year you were projecting it to be 107. You're now saying it's going to be 160. When we get to the detail, it'd be useful to know why that's so different.
Okay, the answer to the first question is the capital monitoring and outturn forecasts are reported to executive every quarter. The last publicly available document is July executive, and that will be updated in October. Executive will then get the Q2 position with the most up-to-date forecast of the spending year. The answer to the question is very complex, and that's why I steered to the report, because there's a lot of reprofiling and phasing timing across years and all sorts, which distorts the picture, which we set out at the beginning of the year. So for example, if you agreed £40 million for a school, you wouldn't necessarily expect that whole school to be built in a year, but you would also think it would be daft if you only agreed the money to put all but the roof on. You'd want to agree the money for the whole thing, wouldn't you? The whole 40 million. And when we profile it over 2 years, that's just one example.
And that's why I'm asking, because I want to know what 300. So what a forecast of 300 million is likely to turn into. To my general experience from doing capital budgets is if you get 75%, you're lucky. So, it's 300 million probably turns into 3/4 of 300 million. So 250 million, something like that. So that and I'm just wondering, where this is heading. And then you can look at the 160 and say where that's likely to head. And then I'd also be interested when you come to it, and I know I don't want an answer now, is why that 107 became 160.
Okay, I would signpost you to both the Q1, Q2 reports, and of course when the bids come forward as well. What I would say in terms of our enhanced financial management across the council in recent years, I'll say particularly, the profiling and the delivery has got much sharper. So I think that will explain why some of these figures were maybe much further north and come down a bit. It wasn't that it was probably unrealistic and maybe overly optimistic perspectives.
I've never found any business that's very good at forecasting capital, because you put it all in the worst case, because you might have to spend it and then you don't, because you're always slower than you think you're going to be, and then you sometimes accrue it but often you can't, and then it always snowplows. And I'm looking back to my notes from 2021, and it snowplowed then and it continues to snowplow. So I'm just interested to get a feel for it. I'm not picking at it, because it's the way all businesses work, but I just want to get a feel for it. But I will look at the report.
Yes, and it's like I was saying, it's getting much better in terms of its realism, definitely.
Might be relying on it not being. Anyway, sorry.
Yeah.
Okay.
Whatever you do, it's going to annoy somebody as well. Right. Anything else to add to this section?
I've got nothing to add to agenda item 28.
Okay. Is there anything that we haven't covered off that we want to, any questions that we haven't resolved? And again, I'd give the opportunity if there are questions that come up that you want to see in each of the department directorate budgets. I think if Liam can go through Liam and then we can collate them. Sorry, David, had a question. Oh, sorry, saw the hand moving. Jane.
Yes, right. It might be a stupid question because I haven't done this before, but the staff savings moving forward was another 7 million on top of 3 something this year. It feels like a very big number, but some of that will be reinvested, will it? Putting people elsewhere. Is
Yeah,
that right?
let me just go to where I think you've got the figure from, page 28. I think is where it says workforce savings 25, 26.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So the figure you're talking about is in the bottom right. Just to stress, this is a cumulative over 3 years. So if you turn back, that's all right. So if you turn back one page, you'll see it was 6.8, and then previous page 23, 24, it was 3.36. So if you 3.36 plus another 3 million and a bit, and then a bit more, of a million, yeah.
Okay. Cool.
And the answer to the second part of your question of yes, that's the savings, and you'll see the savings in the specific submissions in terms of where they're coming from. But you will also see the growth, which is we are having to invest in extra people in this area because of these responsibilities or this ambition. So all of that will certainly be transparent for 25, 26. If you want to see the previous 2 years, then we'd have to go, it will be in the medium-term financial plan that went to council in February where are we, 24, and we February 24 and February 23, that would give you, so February 23 plus February 24, and then February 25 will give you the 3 years story of all those investments and savings. That's right.
Yeah, okay, cool. Thank you.
Okay.
Great, gonna move us. There.
I just want to clarify the additional information that both you, Mark, and all you requested in terms of sort of detailed salary figures. Can you hear me better now? Normally everyone can hear me, so that's fine. But yes, no, of course. Could we also have sort of the head count each year and also the average salary each year?
Yeah, personnel board have that.
Yeah.
Okay, I would say head count is
as of a date, that's fine. As of the year end date, that's fine.
I would say FTEs is a much better representation than head count.
Okay.
So I was going for FTEs.
Okay. Okay.
Being as I'm given the total budget and FTEs, I'm sure I can calculate the average.
Average, fine, yeah.
So yes.
Martin, thank you.
Yeah, just a word of caution that the average salary on FTEs depends on the qualification of the people you're employing. If you're employing more qualified people, it will make it look perhaps not quite as appealing. So you need some sort of statement to see what the profile is of the workforce. So it's becoming more qualified, it will become more expensive by definition.
I think it's an excellent point. Otherwise, you end up also with two sets of numbers. One's a net total FTE, one's just a division of one by the other. I think we need to have some caution in that, as the impressions it can also give wrongly. Pauline.
I don't actually agree with you. You're doing the same business, therefore qualifications are irrelevant. It's the cost of actually producing the widget that's important.
Fair point. Martin.
If we're going to use technology to improve the output, if you go and work for a commercial company and you want somebody who's better qualified to use technology, you have to pay more. Simple fact of life.
Dave.
However, with the automation, you'll need less staff, so the total cost will still go down.
We may get away with fewer staff, but they will be better paid.
Cost per widget. Anything else? Recommendations are set out, so note, and then we're obviously going to go through the rest of this over the next couple of weeks, and then we're going to look at reserves quickly in a minute as well. Everyone happy with to support the recommendations? Anyone to the contrary? No hands raised against. Okay, thank you very much. On to the next item, which is then looking at reserves.
Okay, thank you, Chairman. I'll be much more concise on this. You'll be pleased to know. I think the paper sets out the position quite clearly. I've said before, it's an easy yet potentially reckless thing to do is to raid reserves down to dangerous or unviable levels from an ongoing sustainable point of view. I brought this to last year's ONS. I also stressed there is no perfect science behind a reserve. Anyone could argue a different figure. In fact, you might all argue different figures. But the main point is overall, it has to feel safe. It's in the round. Are we safe? And you'll see on some pictures we've got in there. I know they're not great, but they're off the government's website, where we've got, say, where we sit in terms of our ring fence and unring fenced reserves. Every authority is different. Not many authorities have the SDL approach that we have. forward funding and bridging loans. Not many authorities have built their own town centre and are still paying for it. So not necessarily authorities have housing companies or what have you, you know. So there's all sorts of different reasons why authorities have different risks and should appropriately set aside funds to guard against those risks. I do stress it's not perfect science. It's about it having a sense of safeness in the round. And ultimately, the call on the safeness of the reserves falls on me. But of course, it's a relevant component to the budget setting process. Don't think I'll say any more because I think it's all kind of laid out quite clearly. One other point that I would just say that ONS were asked to, I think last time, what's the movement from last year? Well, the page 45 says it's got worse by 18.5 million. 4.9 million was what we agreed to take from reserves to fund the budget, which we've covered already. And the DSG deficit's gone up by 13.6. It's not going to take too many years at 20 million to take away 78 million pounds or move that to a dangerous level.
Any questions, Pauline?
Just to start on page 41, the two things that have changed dramatically, and I don't know whether it's us that's moved or somebody else, is the total debt as a percentage of core spending power, where we used to be reasonably well above average and are now massively, we used to be massively below average and are now reasonably, quite probably difficult to tell, but maybe 10-20% above average. And the debt servicing as a percentage of core spending power, which has gone down, which is probably related. I just wonder if you'd like to give us any explanation or understanding behind those two changes.
Yes, I'm sure, and I don't have the last year's report, but I am sure that we used to have a higher debt as a percentage of core spending, and it's now moved back towards the centre.
I'll give Graham a few seconds. Any other questions?
Oh,
Okay.
okay, right. Yes. So, what's happened is, so it's debt as a percentage of core spending power. Debt. No, right. One's called debt servicing and one's called debt, and the two graphs are switched over, as in they're now in the opposite. This is downloaded from the website, and they've changed places, right? So the total debt as a percentage of core spending power has moved fractionally towards the centre ground, which is good. It used to be, so it meant that our total debt as a percentage was even higher. It's now higher than average, but it's come towards average, and now actually falls in it's hard to see, but it's actually shaded, a little band in the middle, and it's now just in that shaded band of central position, which is really good. So I was really pleased about that. Our total debt, we were an outlier. We have very high levels of debt because town centre regeneration, strategic development, housing companies, commercial investments, all of this added together means we are I would say very high. I would say bordering on very high levels of debt for the size of authority. This graph shows that we've, in relative to us, well, it's all relative, so I can't say, but I know, but we probably might be a bit of both, but we have certainly improved our position that our debt position as a percentage of core spending has now moved into the central band as opposed to being an outlier as high, which I think is a really positive, reassuring thing, because we were very highly debt geared for all those
Graham?
reasons. Oh,
Sorry, it's only me.
Imogen.
Can we just clarify that this is relative to other councils?
yes.
Yeah, so it's not realistic. It hasn't really changed. It's relative to other councils.
Well, it can be a factor of both things.
But
It is a relativity thing. You're
I know
absolutely
we've
right.
worked hard to reduce the amount of outstanding debt that we have anyway, but it is relative to other councils. We're doing relatively well by the sounds of it.
Yes.
But yes.
This comes from Offlog. Just go on their website, bang in Wokingham, and it all comes up. The other graph that you talked about, Pauline, was debt servicing as a percentage of core spending power. And we were on the left side, which means we were very low. That was not a good thing. That meant that we weren't flushing as much through the revenue account as other authorities were. And if you remember last year, we added another million or so to what's called minimum revenue provision equals debt repayment. And that has helped us move towards a central position, which is really reassuring. So if you think of those authorities that have really come under pressure financially, they haven't provided MRP, minimum revenue provision, so they've taken loads of borrowing but didn't know how to repay it. We were quite relatively low, and we've now moved to a central position. So I'm really pleased with that.
Thank you. And you've now got both sets of figures. So the other question I had was the equalisation fund. So it looks like it's gone from 2.5 to 4.6. You know what that's all about? Or can you explain what that's about? I'm sure you know what's on.
Deficit, yes. Oh, yes. So this is the equalisation fund, which is about 3 years ago. When we were much more optimistic about the timing of the solar farm, we baked into the budget £1 million surplus from this scheme, which isn't going to materialise until 26. So this deficit will move further, maybe to 6 or maybe even 7 million. However, we also know that when it's really up and running, it's going to very quickly move into £2 or £3 million surplus as opposed to 1 million. So it will reach a trough and then it will come back quite quickly. It's not great, but it doesn't unduly worry me, especially now we have the commitment of the 2026 go live.
Sorry, the next one was Town Centre Regen, which I think is probably good news. So that the reserve has reduced. And I presume that's because you've got less worry about your rental income. Is that right? It's gone from 9.3 to 6.2.
Yeah, that was I suppose part of the key consideration of risks is going to be how complete the project is. So we're now more complete, is more fully formed, and therefore an area that we could take the reserve down a bit. However, there's still a significant debt associated with it.
Yeah, which was always what was profile.
Yeah.
Fairer funding review. It's gone from 19 to 16. That's 20 to 16. Is there any reason for that?
I can't remember off the top of my head, but again, it's one of those where it's not going to be a perfect science calculation. It's going to be a real sense of, and
It's quite a big change. It's a 4 million change, if I've read it right, which is quite a lot. Maybe you can tell us afterwards.
yeah. I can't remember. I mean,
Yes,
these reserves are fluctuating all the time. I guess they're,
So this is mitigating unknown risks from future local government finances.
yes.
So I wouldn't expect it to be going down, really. So it's a genuine question.
No, yeah, I understand. I guess what I would like to stress is the arriving at these figures is not a particularly strong mathematical calculation. The key message I want to give this committee is we can play around with all these figures, but at the end of the day, they add up to 78 million and they've gone down by 18.5. There'll be movements within.
So maybe what I'm trying to say, Graham, is that sensible? It's gone down by, I think, 4 million, which is 25% of 20 something percent. Is that right? Is it done for a good reason or is it not done for a good reason? That's all. Yeah. Sorry, I only read this afternoon, so I've sent you a note otherwise.
Yeah, these would have been evolved and developed over the years, so I've kind of lost all the specifics, but I understand the question and I'll get back to you.
Yeah, we should add that to the list of. Thanks. Anything else, Pauline?
The only other one that's changed very significantly, apart from the DSG deficit, which I understand, is the revenue grants, which has gone up by 2.5 million. Is there any logic to that?
I'm keeping it, I'm back. That will be much easier to answer. That will be about specific revenue grants. So it might be some that's come in around the Ukraine scheme, for example. So that will be a much easier question. It will say, well, we have all these new grants that have come in. That one will be much more scientific than a provision to guard against future local government finance settlements. Yes.
If I was looking at future local government finance settlements, I'd be sticking more in, not taking money out myself. But.
Yes, and I would say if we weren't in a rainy day, I might be doing. In fact, I have been over all the previous years building up to the rainy day, so that's why it's there. But now it's time to dig deep, I suppose, and see where we can take greater risk. The whole thing is balance of risk, isn't it? So I guess it's risk in context, and the context is it's really tough financially. We have to go and dip into reserves. Not ideal, but in previous years we've been able to build them up in order to have the luxury of being able to do that now. So I wouldn't for 1 minute, Pauline, say that I feel a lot more optimistic about future local government finance settlements, but I would just say there's a place to go right now in order to balance the books.
Dave?
Just an administrative point. Can I suggest that we change the format of this report slightly and show that prior year and current year, and then we can have a little commentary on the bigger variances that everyone can see, and obviously stops Pauline surprising you with all these questions.
Yeah, the table on bottom of page 45 was intended to do that, but clearly failed abysmally.
Sorry, if I'd read it earlier, I would have sent you the questions in advance, but I didn't read it until I picked it up here today.
But I think Dave's comment actually is a valid one. Actually, if we're putting these in and we're trying to do it, then it would avoid Pauline's questions if she leaves it until the day to read it again.
Yeah, I'll be honest, I was trying to deliberately steer us away from each individual line, but if that's where you want to go, then I'll brace myself for next year's round and we'll lay it out in more detail.
And that isn't to say that we have got a problem with variances. Variances, as long as we can understand them, is absolutely fine.
Yeah, it's just sometimes there's a less convincing argument than others. as you clearly received.
I think such is the nature of reserves.
Yeah.
It's raining.
Mm.
I'm just conscious of the time. Still got a packed agenda to get through. Any other questions specifically on reserves? Okay, everyone happy to note the recommendations? Anyone to the contrary? No, brilliant. Thank you very much. So lots of things came from that need to be picked up as in the next couple of weeks. If anyone has any more comments, Pauline.
We just minute our thanks to the finance team for doing a good job on this.
Beat me to it. It's a comprehensive report and lots of data, lots of questions to come. Looking forward to the next round. And I think it will be useful just to see for everyone that previous budget format so we know what we're looking for. And comfortable trousers and warm drinks. Right. Thank you very much for that. We're going to move on. If Graham, feel free to leave.
Thank you.
You're more than welcome to stay for the rest of the evening.
Thank you for that offer.
Yeah. You have been given the opt-out.
I'll leave,
Right.
leave you in their capable hands. See it. Thank you. Bye.
Thanks. Okay, so we still have quite a few items to get through for this evening. The next one is to go to the emergency planning service update. I'm not sure who has this item. Online.
Hi,
Steve. Brilliant. Harry, welcome. Steve, welcome back. Over to you.
yeah, sorry everyone not being there in person. I've got a bit of a
Fine.
back end of a cold, so I didn't want to spread it around the room. But yeah, Harry Williamson, emergency planning manager for the emergency planning team. Steve, you going to say a few words first? So happy for me to sort of jump in.
Thank you, Harry. So Steve Bain, the Interim Assistant Director for Environmental Safety. So we want to present a report tonight, which is an informative report. Essentially, it's a report on the improvement journey that we took emergency planning through. So over the last year, we've been really working hard at raising its profile, looking at its systems and processes, and putting it in a much stronger place at the corporate centre of the council. This report will take you through that with all the examples and the evidence to support that. It will also take you through what the role of emergency planning is and what the plans for the future are for emergency planning. Our intent is that there'll be an annual report on emergency planning, which will set out its achievements for the previous year and its sort of forward agenda for the forthcoming year as well. So it sort of links in with all of those issues. The purpose of the report is to take you through that thought process, provide you with some examples, and allow members of this committee to raise any questions as they see fit. So Harry, if you take us through the detail, please.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. So a bit of a reminder for you also, the council, we're a category 1 responder under the Civil Contingencies Act. So that means we have to have the full weight, the full duties that are in that act. So category 1 responders are also responders like the police, the fire service, ambulance, the environment agency. So we do have that kind of full weight of being a category 1 responder. There's various kind of duties that placed upon us, but I think the one that summarises it best is that we've got to have the plans and procedures in place to ensure we can respond to major incidents or a range of risks. So as Steve said, over the last sort of 12 months, we've gone on this kind of improvement journey. I thought I'd just kind of take you through some of those key points. When we kind of developed this kind of improvement journey, that's come from a few different sources of where we've identified improvements we need to take on. So those have come from lessons that we've identified from exercises that we've done, from training that we've done, for incidents that we've responded to, but also incidents that have happened in sort of in other boroughs or other parts of the country. So not just thinking about what we've been doing. A lot of them also came from a peer review we did with Oxfordshire County Council around this time last year, and they helped us develop sort of a list of priorities, and those are on sort of page 51. In the appendices 1, that's a more detailed account of sort of delivery plan going forward, but page 51 kind of summarises more thematically what we would be doing. Some of the ones that I really want us to be sort of prioritising and to identify with yourselves is, I think we've done a really good job, as Steve said, as making ourselves more visible a visible corporate service that we are. But I think we now need to get to that point where we need to make sure we're detailing that governance and kind of formalising a lot of those arrangements. So as Steve said, coming to yourselves annually with this report, making sure that where we're identifying our lessons from those different sources, making sure that we're being kind of held to account as a team, but as a council, that we're learning from those, we're embedding them in our plans, we're validating those through training and exercising. So making sure we're doing it in the right way. And the reason why that's so important is because we could at some point be pulled in front of a public inquiry. Who kind of knows what incidents we might kind of face that might come on occur in the borough. So it is really important that we're kind of showing that kind of due process and doing it in the right way, because those are the types of details that do get picked apart in inquiries, as some of you might have witnessed in some of the ones we've seen recently. Other parts we'll be doing is kind of bringing forward a more forward look training program. So further developing role profiles and making sure that we're looking at the capabilities of our responders and making sure we have the right training in place to enable them to have those correct capabilities. We'll also be bringing forward a more strengthened approach to business continuity, so building upon what we have currently, to ensure we kind of have a more consistent corporate response in terms of preparation and response to business continuity incidents across a range of risks. Other parts what we're doing as well is sort of deciding or developing the council's approach to community resilience, something we've talked about before when I came in February to discuss the emergency response framework. One of our conversations we had was community resilience. Currently, it's something that if we find opportunities for, then we'll try and deliver it, but we haven't really got a defined approach. I think that's really important for us to understand what we kind of must do and kind of how we can resource it, because that can be resourced in various ways. It doesn't need to be just us in our little team of 2 doing it. It can be kind of how we work with partners or how we work with other services who might already be doing those aspects, and how we can kind of amend and add to what they're already doing. And the last part, or the last bullet point there, is kind of how we engage with yourselves as borough councillors, as members, as Overview and Scrutiny, and looking at what training and exercising that you might require, and kind of what engagement you would like as well. So really kind of developing that piece, and again, that feeding into that overall governance kind of part of our work. Further on, going down the report, we've got a list of some of the incident responses that we've been involved in. Ones I pick out of this would be the sort of the storm Henk and the flooding that we had at the start of the year. So obviously that was declared a major incident across the Thames Valley, and a lot of work went into making sure we were part of that multi-agency response, but also ensuring that we gave a good internal response to our communities as well. One of the reasons why I've sort of raised that one as a point is obviously we're getting to that winter season, and actually as you'll notice, our grounds are already saturated. The rivers are full, the drains are full. Oh, that's how it feels, at least. And I think we are in that heightened risk position. I think it's only last week that Thames was high, the Loddon was high as well. So for us, that really is a risk going into this winter, which is, as part of the appendices, and we can get onto that in a bit later, is the fact that we've updated our flood response plan and our sandbag policy, and taking on the lessons that have been developed from Storm Henk, but also from some exercises that have been done as well. So hopefully kind of increasing our preparedness for what could be a very kind of wet winter. One other kind of unique one that's on this incident list that I want to sort of draw your attention to is mutual aid. So because a lot of the emergency planning teams across Berkshire, on average, they work out to be about 2 people per team. We do our best to support each other where we can. So you'll see that we supplied support to Slough during the recent high-rise Mosaic apartment fire that they had. So it's good for us in terms of It means we bag a few brownie points. So when we're in that position later on, other Berkshire local authorities will come help us if we do have a major incident. But also it's really good because we can go over there, see how they respond to their incidents, take our own lessons away, and it's also good for sort of that professional development for our team as well. So we always endeavour to help our partners kind of where we can. Training and exercising, I won't go into as much detail. We do vary training exercising. Some of this list is internal focus, so where we're looking at increasing the confidence and capabilities of our sort of internal duty officers. But we do get involved in a lot of multi-agency exercises as well. Most recently was one called Blue Nimbus, which was a flooding exercise last year, where we had assistant directors, operational staff, a really big response to a flooding incident. And it kind of highlighted why we do it, because then when we had the Storm Hank flooding a few months later, it was a well-polished response for ourselves, which was good. So those are those aspects. And other in the report you'll see the training exercise we've got planned for the next year. To raise with yourselves would be that we are looking to include members. We've got 2 exercises next year, one around business continuity and the other one's around opening up or responding to like a humanitarian assistance type incident. Both of those we're kind of happy to have you involved in some capacity. So that'll be something that we'll look to do. If you'd like it. Emergency plans, so there's a list of the plans that we updated this year. The emergency response framework was one that we brought to you back in February, which was a bit of a modernisation of our major incident plan, rather than a revolution of it. It was a modernisation of kind of how we respond to these large scale incidents. And then some of the documents that we've got in the appendices for comment and review are our flood plan, our off-site reservoir plan, and a sandbag policy as well, which we can get to in a second. All I would say with the off-site reservoir plan, if you're looking at it feeling like bits are missing, it's because it is redacted, so it's an official sensitive document based on the types of information that's within it. So there are sections that have been removed. Happy to potentially speak offline or take actions away if there is any details that you're looking for in there that you can't see. I just couldn't share it in this essentially a public forum. Plans that we're prioritising in the next year. So we have a lockdown plan for our buildings. So we'll tie that into sort of any legislation that comes out of Martin's Law. A rest centre plan, which is why we're going to exercise that in the coming year as a humanitarian assistance plan. And business continuity as well. There's 2 others on there that are a bit more internal facing, but for the other ones, we'd probably be looking to bring them to ONS for comment and review in the future if that's something that you'd like to see. Business continuity, I think I've mentioned this at the start, is we're looking at kind of modernising and strengthening our current programme for business continuity across a range of risks. We currently have we have a lot of service level plans, and what we're looking to do is develop a sort of stronger corporate response plan to how we would respond to various incidents, and aligning ourselves with good practice guidance and the international standards as well. And then lastly, appreciate it's got information in there. We're looking to bring something in the future as part of Grenfell. So the Grenfell Inquiry Phase 2 report came out a month or so ago. There are quite a few local authority recommendations within that. So that's been factored into our delivery plan. And we're working with housing to sort of develop our sort of council response to that and how we'll take those recommendations forward. And that's due to go to CLT in a couple of months' time. And so we'll bring it to ONS as well for comment, but that's another thing that's been factored into our delivery plan. I'll pause there because that's kind of the first half, and then the second part is going into those flood response, off-site reservoir plan and sandbag policy. But is there any kind of questions at this point onto the actual work we have been doing and the work we're planning on doing in the coming year?
Any questions on that so far? Caroline? Oops, sorry.
Sorry, can I ask one? It's on page 88. And I should have probably said I should have declared it as a special interest. I live near River Loddon, and you say about riparian awareness. Part of it is licence to the fishing. Do you have a lot of problems? Because some of the trees are falling in, and you say you have enforcement. Do you have a lot of problems with other owners of riversides?
So this is page 88. So this part of the flood response plan, it goes into what the different roles for the different internal services are. So this section is obviously saying what the role of the flooding and drainage team is. So they are doing a campaign at the moment around riparian awareness. So Steve, I don't know if you can give an update on this, but I know it's gone live recently. And if you go on our website, you can now, there was I think what was happening was we're having flood incidents or surface water very quick responding ditches and drains that weren't being cleared because the riparian ownership is with a resident or a homeowner and they weren't aware of it. So there's now a campaign the flood and drainage team have done. So you can go on our website and you can find out kind of where your local ditch or stream is by typing in your address. So I think to answer that question, yes, there have been issues. And I think that's kind of why they've responded by putting that into place. But if you wanted a more detailed answer, because that sits under flooding and drainage team, it'd be something we would take away and ask them for a response.
Thank you.
Any more questions so far? I've just got one, which is more of a comment. I mean, and it's an incredibly detailed report. So thanks for all the work that's gone into this. And I declare an interest because I work in comms and marketing. There doesn't seem to be much of a reference to how comms works strategically during some of the major incidents that come up. And I'm thinking of the role of COVID. And the work of comms during the COVID period about keeping residents informed. There's lots of incredible detail in here about Silver Command, Gold Command, etc. But strategic comms in an emergency situation, it would be good just to get a view, not necessarily today, but just how does comms and marketing work across the authority when it comes to a gold, silver, or bronze command incident, and how's that triggered? And I think also things like there's a comment in here about, I think it's under the burst reservoir, about how press will get on site faster. So I think it is that cascade of information. I'd be interested to find out offline or later on how comms figures into this, because it doesn't get much of a mention.
Yeah, no, I can do comms. That's fine. I can cover you off on that. So this is probably more in the emergency response framework, which we brought in February, because this is probably not specific to floods or reservoirs.
In which case, I apologise.
No,
if you could send me a copy of that, that would be quite useful.
Yeah. No, it's on our website. So that's a public-facing document. Again, it's slightly redacted. How it would work across this would be across a range of risks. In emergency planning, our kind of role is that kind of horizon scanning. So, for example, I don't know if you're aware, there was a ex-Hurricane Kirk was looking at maybe hitting our borough on Wednesday, but actually we found out recently that it's going to fall further south. It's going to go to France. So what we're kind of doing is we kind of look at those risks, and when it's that kind of rising tide incident, like a storm or like a flood, what we do is we bring together all relevant services based on our kind of triggers. So a couple of weeks ago, those triggers were the fact that there was an amber weather warning for rain. So adverse weather plan, that says that we set up a group. So then what we do, we bring all the services together that we think are going to be impacted, could be impacted, might be interested. On the whole, we do kind of cast our net quite wide, and we let services decide whether or not those risks might impact them, but we do have a standing kind of agenda. Comms is on every single one of those. And then as part of that agenda, we'll kind of go through as a silver group, essentially what that is, looking at those different risks and what comms we should be doing based on those risks. So if it was something like a weather warning for wind and rain, it might be that we go, let's share comms from the Met Office, let's share their weather warnings because they're the experts. Let's encourage people to take care when travelling because there might be fallen trees and things like that. When we then stand up a really kind of formal response because it's a major incident, we go into tactical coordinating group meetings and strategic coordinating group meetings as part of the Thames Valley Local Resilience Forum. So those, again, have certain thresholds and certain triggers, and we attend those. So, for example, Steve is one of our silver duty officers, so we often send Steve to the tactical meetings. And then for strategic meetings, we normally send Giorgio from Lico, but we've also sent people like Graham Evers, obviously, who's in the room earlier as well, to these gold meetings. They all discuss comms there as well, and that is how we do comms together as a partnership. There's no point the fire service saying one thing and Wokingham saying another and the police saying a third thing. So that's always on the agenda as well. And what they'll set up is a media advisory cell, and that brings together all the different comms leads from across the affected authorities or affected agencies, and they kind of develop comms together so that it can be shared kind of once by everyone, if that makes sense. So that's kind of the multi-agency bit. That's kind of our bit. Comms, yeah, they kind of sit across it all. So if we are having tactical level conversations at that silver level, we have a comms rep there. If we're having a gold level with CLT, we have comms in there as well, because essentially CLT should be the ones signing off that communication strategy. It should sit with them when we're kind of at that major incident threshold.
Thank you. That's brilliant. Thank you. Mary Louise.
Thank you. Very quickly, it's really good to see that some of the learning from Grenfell is already being pushed in, because I think it was for all of us a wake-up call in terms of, I was really stunned by the lack of training or the lack of interest there had been in training in the Kensington and Chelsea Council among councillors, as well as even more so actually than staff. So it's really good to see that happening. I think there's still a room for more emphasis, you know what I'm going to say, because I always do, about community resilience, about building that community resilience. And it also speaks to Mark's point about comms, because the comms are going to be dependent, or the success of the comms is not so much dependent on the structure that you have as the extent to which it meets the expectation understanding of the community. Yeah. And one of the things, you know, that leaps out first of all is, if you stopped any person on the street, particularly in a floodplain, and you asked them whose job it was to give out sandbags, they would say the council. Yeah. And we collectively would be failing at the very, you know, first point, because that there is that lack of understanding. You know, there is a miscommunication around responsibility. So, and one of the ways that you can address that is through, you know, community resilience, building community resilience, building a sense of community responsibility and agency as well. You know, how are those sandbags going to be delivered? Who in the community is going to be in charge? The problem is, we know 9 out of 10 rescues are affected by members of the public, not the emergency services. Yeah, that is what we need to build on. And the problem is at the moment that it seems to be, or the potential problem is that it's focused so much on this structure and not so much on, you know, building the capacity on the ground. But I always say the same thing.
No, but I think it's really valid though, and I think that's, for me, that's kind of why one of our points is developing our approach, because what we currently have now is we're quite opportunist. And I don't think that's the right approach. It might be that we get the right outcomes from it, but I think what we don't understand is kind of what our communities are needing from us. At this point, we're kind of making assumptions about what they need, and that's the wrong way to do it. There's some really interesting, maybe not public lessons as of yet in the public domain, how there was a evacuation that went on in Wraysbury during January 2024. And there was a lot of tension there, because it was felt like the authorities were instigating an evacuation that the public the residents didn't necessarily think was required, and that then caused tensions and made the response wasn't necessarily the way that the agency thought it was going to go, because of those assumptions were being made.
Absolutely. I'm sorry, but we learned from Grenfell that that trust which is, is absolutely essential for things to build forward. And it can be, destroyed very, very quick, very early on in the response. And that's partly because, as we know, the expectations and the visibility of the council, becomes much greater in those circumstances. So it's just a question of like how, the structure of the response and the comms around it and the preparation for it reflect, that need to build resilience and understanding within the community as to what it's possible to have, what can be done and how and what people themselves can do. Yeah. And how we can be seen to be supporting them rather than developing, and then, putting into motion a response that is sometimes not felt to be, appropriate.
So I think just to give you some reassurance on that, there's two aspects of work, or two parallel approaches that we've got. So the first is the corporate centre, making sure that we're fulfilling our statutory responsibilities, make sure that we've got systems and processes, make sure that we've got valid plans, and making sure that we're working with our sort of partners through the local resilience forum. So that would be the utility companies, the Met Office, fire, police, ambulance, and all of those groups. So we're strengthening and improving that area of work. It's already positive, but we're strengthening it more, which hopefully the reports brings through. We will move in and we will be looking at those community issues. So in a previous scrutiny report to do with drainage, we raised about the drainage team working with the local flood wardens in the communities. So what sort of training, development, support, advice, being a convener for all of that good practice, and that is work that is coming through. So that will start to build on that. So that area of work will come, it will strengthen and it will develop, but we've got to get the machine sort of in a more sort of mature and established position, which we are now doing, and then we'll move on to that. So the answer is absolutely understood, and we will be advancing on that in the near future.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. I think we can probably I think we can be quite clever with how we resource it as well. So I think our risks don't stop at our borders in Wokingham. So you'll hear me say a few times that we're a little team of two in Wokingham. But actually, if we use our partners to do shared sessions or shared work and shared training, shared comms. Similarly, there's opportunities to work with the fire service, with the EA, with our town and parish council colleagues as well. So I think we can be quite clever with how we do it in a way that hopefully is quite efficient but effective. And that's kind of why we need the approach, because at the moment I feel like, as I said, we're kind of opportunists, which isn't necessarily the best way for us to use our time and resource. And then in terms of the Grenfell recommendations, we'll bring that forward in a bit more depth in the future. But we're going to try and contextualize them as well, because we have very different housing stock and a different demographics, different community. So our response would be different, and those risks are different. However, a lot of those lessons kind of cross-cut those risks. So a lot of them talk about humanitarian assistance, humanitarian response, taking care of the most vulnerable during a response. Well, those are things that it doesn't matter if it's a housing fire or a flood or a reservoir or a power outage. Those are things that we need to be doing regardless of the risk. So very much kind of taking those on board, hopefully contextualizing them within that report. And there are aspects of that we kind of already are working on as well, which for me was somewhat reassuring that they're either in the pipeline, we'd already identified them, or the things that we're kind of currently working on sort of at this minute. So we'll certainly bring that in the future.
So just to finalise on that, especially in relation to the Grenfell. So there's the systems and the process things, which is the management things, the training, the development, the reviews, the risk assessments, the system and process things go through. The learning points that we can take from Grenfell for us as an organisation are the behavioural and the value things. So the residents of Grenfell, their concern was we're not being listened to, nobody's listening to us. So that's a part of the work that we can develop. So systems and processes, behaviours and values, will bring it and flush that. And as a corporate sort of entity, we can learn from those and we can test ourselves against those to make sure our future response is better, or at least vastly improved. So think of it in those respects as well.
Great. Okay, so that's the first half done. Are you going to go through all the detail of the next three, or are you happy that?
Would you like me to? Or
not really. No, I mean, no, they're long. They are excellent reports. I want to make sure we're doing them justice. There's a recommendation that's for the appendices for flood plan, off-site reservoir plan, and sandbag policy, for asking for members to comment. I'm not sure whether we want to comment tonight or whether you want to have the opportunity to read them in more detail and come back with any questions via Liam that we can feed back in that we want to change. Jane.
It was an out of interest question about sandbags. Just to prove I'd read it, why we were modelling based on 2003 numbers? Has not a lot changed in the last 20 years? So
2003, it was based on the scale of the flood. So rather than kind of population data, it was based on the scale of the flood, because that was quite a significant flood in the borough.
And even with the population changes, we wouldn't expect anything worse, no? Hopefully not, obviously.
Yeah, I mean, I guess because of the way that we kind of with climate change, potentially we'll see an increase in the floodplains getting larger. I don't know what development has been like since 2003 to kind of say what our numbers are. Yeah, it was what was kind of in the current policy, and this is essentially a revision of that policy. We can take it away, and if you want us to look at what the numbers at risk are, I could bring that if that was something you're interested in. On the whole, the sandbag policy is where we comment on the fact that we're not able to provide sandbags to everyone. We haven't got the resources to be able to do that in terms of the storage number of bags, but also the people to do it, and that's kind of where that prioritization is. And it's obviously looking at our infrastructure, requests from the emergency services, and our kind of most vulnerable people. So even if we do look at it from what the population size is, we probably wouldn't get a helpful number that could determine kind of what we need, if that makes sense.
Great. Martin. Oh, so Martin and Pauline.
Oops. So really, having come from a world where we get the public to do a lot of the work when they have to go on those slides in the aeroplane, giving the public the information and empowering them to deal with their problems, because there isn't any way we can supply the numbers required. If it's a serious incident, they're going to be on their own, because we just don't have the numbers either in the council or the emergency services. So and that comes back to the sandbags issue. If all the council did was give them a discount code to buy their own sandbags and the sand for those people who know they live in the areas, or the other means to mitigate flooding, that's probably the best thing we could do. Because if you had a serious flood, there's no way you could distribute the numbers of sandbags that you need in time. We're not like some of the Yorkshire Dales where it's a regular occurrence and everybody is stocked up. We're an infrequent case, 1 in 5 years, 1 in 10 years. So enabling the public to take some position of their own and enabling them, that is the way to go. But having that structure that you've talked about is also very good. And I'd probably have a chat with you about things that I've noticed from my own industry that might be useful.
Yeah, that'd be wonderful. Always happy to sort of take that experience on board. One thing I haven't really mentioned is that we are doing a bit of a comms piece around that kind of self-resilience. Now we're coming up to flood season, kind of like we are in flood season already, with some of the impacts you might have seen across the borough last couple of weeks. But we are kind of doing that comms piece, and that includes sort of signposting people to where they can find out more information on taking their own resilience measures, steps, where they can buy sandbags sort of from, that kind of detail. So we've already drafted that up. We thought we were very early to it. Turns out we're not because of how the weather's been. And that's going to be sent out to that piece. The communications team have sort of advised us that the best way to do that is via the newsletters, the email newsletters, because that tends to get the most engagement on these types of stories. But it'll be getting shared on social media as well. But equally, if there's community groups or areas that you'd like us to make sure we're getting into, if you want support in sharing those messages, that'd be great. Or identifying anyone that don't think received them, or maybe an isolated group, then obviously let us know, and we'll try and find ways to make sure they're getting what they need.
Pauline.
Another just out of interest question, really. I'm interested in what you do downstream of reservoirs and whether there's any legislation or control about who can, in the same way as you've got the nuclear zone around AEA, or sorry, AWE.
Yeah.
Is there an equivalent reservoir zone on maps anywhere, and can I have a look at it? And what control is there from a planning point of view?
You can't build near the embankments because that would be a structural issue. I don't think there's any kind of reservoir safeguarding, and I'm going to look at Trevor in the room, who's well placed. I don't think there is anything. I think because the risk is deemed to be low and managed risk. I think it's deemed that we don't then require them.
Tell the Germans in the Ruhr.
Sorry, Pauline. I think we'll have to try and provide you with an answer. I mean, there's obviously flood risk zones which you're not recommended to build in, around rivers and things like that. The reservoirs are treated, I think, slightly different. So we'll get you an answer to that. I don't know off the top of my head, I have to say.
Yeah, I know there isn't. We don't get consulted on it, so we get consulted on flood zones for emergency planning perspective. Obviously, the flood team do as well. We get consulted on AWE. We get consulted on sort of major developments in terms of emergency service provision and accessibility and things like that. Reservoirs we don't, and I think it is because it's a managed risk. So we have. For each reservoir, they have an on-site plan. They have inspections once a year, and then a very thorough one every 10 years. So I think because of the legislation that's involved and the, I don't want to say red tape because it's very important red tape, but because of the requirements that are put upon them, I then don't think that they require it. And in the on-site reservoir plans, obviously we're looking at an off-site one here, but each reservoir has an on-site plan, and there'll be steps in there. There are stages to a response. So the first stage, for example, would be that they'll open up a spillway, and they kind of let water gradually sort of go down to the drains or down the spillway. So, for example, I was at Early Town Council a couple of weeks ago, and we saw them testing their kind of mechanisms at Maiden Early Lake. And so the first thing you do is you do that drawdown, and you get those water levels nice and low. So there are things that you can do as part of kind of managing a reservoir responsibly to avoid that kind of breach ever occurring, which is probably why it's not legislated in terms of a planning way in the sense we see with flood zones. But yeah, I'm sure me and Trevor can put our heads together and have a look in a bit more detail as to why those zones don't exist.
Thank you. It's just interesting. I'm familiar with the Maiden Early Lake one because there used to be flooding on the downside of that. And it was nothing to do with the problem with the dam. It was just runoff and badly designed culverts, which would have been fixed.
Yeah, I was looking at that culvert the other day. Yeah, interesting one. Yeah,
it was taken out in the end because it was causing more trouble than it's worth.
Yep.
Regarding sandbags, Thames Water gave me some very nice sandbags, which are have got something synthetic in them. I think that self-inflate rather than having to use sand. So if anybody's looking for sandbags, you can get them on eBay, and they're very good.
Actually, they were featured on a certain investor television program. Yeah.
Quite often reusable as well. The problem with using with sandbags is that they then collate the sewage and all the nasty stuff in the water that have to be sort of disposed of in a responsible manner, unlike things that are reusable.
Mine was dealing with a burst water main. Very good.
They are actually where we spend some time down in West Sussex. They given out in certain locations down there because they do. You just lay them down and they just swell up 30 or 40 times. You don't even need to fill them, and then when they're dry out, they shrink back down. Right. Any more questions before we move on?
No, in which case we're happy to note the recommendations, and then the specific call out for everyone is if you have any comments on any of the documents, can you feed them back through Liam, and then we'll pick them up. If not, can I thank you both? They are incredibly comprehensive reports, so thank you for the amount of detail that's gone into them. It's very reassuring. So thank you very much indeed.
And if there's any comments in terms of like how we engage with yourselves as a committee or as members or as representing your kind of local wards, then let us know, because I think that's the picture we kind of want to start developing as well. As much as we're doing that community resilience piece, we also want to know about how you want us to engage with you. So any kind of feedback on that in terms of this or training or exercising, then yeah, please do let us know.
Great, thank you very much. And
Thanks.
You are more than welcome to stay, the pair of you, for the rest of the meeting. But I'd understand it if you wanted to disconnect.
See you later. Thank you.
Right, we're going to move on, and thank you to Marcia and Trevor for patience in this, and for Stephen for being here for the whole session. Stephen, over to you to introduce this.
Thank you very much, Mark. I must admit, I do feel a little bit like a batsman, a middle order batsman who's waited in the pavilion a very long time, but has seen 3 very impressive innings while I've waited. Really excellent reports and really good questioning. I want to start off with a very obvious point. I hope it's very obvious to everyone. We are very fortunate in Wokingham. We have a really high quality and high performing planning service. I think I've known this for a long time. In bits, in the sense that for a good portion of my career as a councillor, I've served on the planning committee, and I've got to know our planning professionals on the development management side well over those years, and I'm always impressed by their dedication, their quality, their professional skill. And more recently, I've obviously become acquainted much more closely with all of the planning policy, SDL side of things as a result of the work on the local plan. And my admiration for our professional colleagues is enormous. We are extremely fortunate that we have such a good planning service, very good planning service. So it's in that context that I want to introduce this report. And the report, which Marcia and Trevor will be able to answer any technical questions you've got on. But the report is a really good testimony to the achievements of the planning service in recent times, and all the things they've managed to do. And one shouldn't underestimate the challenges. And it's worth just saying, as a segue into any questions, that those challenges are not going to dissipate. We can anticipate they are likely to get greater as we look over the horizon to a new planning environment with significant changes likely to come to the National Planning Policy Framework, which are going to increase the amount of work for our planning service. There's no way that can be avoided. And we're hoping, of course, that the government's comments about better resourcing will be realised, because otherwise there is going to be a major capacity challenge in terms of how our planning service deals with the scaling up of the demand for their services. So I just want to put down that marker that this is a high performing, very impressive service, but we can't expect miracles in the future without additional resource to support it. So I think that's probably enough from me. I'm going to hand over to Martin and Trevor. I don't know if they want to say anything or they just want to answer questions.
I'm aware of the time and you've had a long meeting, so I'm just happy to take questions really. But thank you for the introduction, Stephen, and what you said. We both appreciate it.
Pauline.
Thank you. I'd just like to thank the planning team as well. They've been great over the last few weeks. And this report's good because it's the first time I've realised how it all fits together properly. It's quite nice to see the names and who's responsible for what. Well, just one question about planning enforcement. It seems to me when I read the planning enforcement reports every month, the majority of things either are not expedient, not actually a problem at all, or are fixed through a planning application. I'm just wondering if there's anything better we can do in terms of communicating to the residents so that we don't get quite so many planning enforcement cases, because it seems to me you're getting a lot of workload and most of them are, for whatever reason, not really valid.
Good point.
So the number of alleged breaches of planning control to the team does increase year on year. And we monitor the reasons why cases are closed, and 50% of cases are closed because they are not a breach of planning control. And that number, that percentage remains fairly static. And then 30% of cases are closed because we managed to negotiate a retrospective application. So, I mean, one of the things that I keep telling Trevor I'd like to do is charge people if they want to make an allegation. We would charge them, and if it turns out that it's not a breach of planning control, we retain the fee. Or if it is a breach of planning control, then we could refund their fee. But I don't know how we can stop people from lodging requests for service. And a lot of the time it's because neighbours just don't get on with each other.
I was just wondering if the comms team could help a bit, and maybe look at the pattern of what people are complaining about that consistently gets kicked into touch because it isn't a planning problem, and try and educate residents a bit more, because I think genuinely quite a lot of the things that aren't actual planning breaches, people are genuinely reporting them, and they're not always doing it because they don't like their neighbours, but they don't understand the planning position, or they don't understand the system, and maybe a bit of communication about, well, in the end it's costing them money, isn't it? Because every planning thing that you get that isn't valid costs whatever it is. And I think it's about, it's before we charge them, I think it'd be good to do some education.
I'm sure you're right about the education piece. There's a lot for people to learn about the planning system and what isn't possible. I'm sure that's absolutely right. But it is striking how many cases we do get where it's essentially a neighbour dispute and we're being dragged into a neighbour dispute, and it's absolutely right. It's the same with all sorts of things where neighbours fall out and they look to the council to support them against their neighbour, and that is a real problem for us. It does generate a lot of work, and a lot of that work is in truth unnecessary.
So is that a yes, you might consider doing a bit of comms?
I'm always open to ideas about improving comms, because comms is central to a lot of things that the council does, probably almost everything the council does. So the better our comms can be, the better. But I suppose what I was trying to do is strike a cautionary note. However well informed people are, if they fall out with their neighbours, they don't really care whether it's legitimate or not. They want to make their point.
Okay.
Sorry, one not too long ago, I think it pretty much bankrupted one of the neighbours in a hedge dispute. So it's, the communications, it's our service to the public. What the public make of it is sadly out of our hands.
Caroline and then George.
Mine's more of a follow-on. You were talking about charging people who report it, and I'm sorry, I'm probably one of those ones who report, but I'm on a planning committee. Could we not charge the person who's breached the planning? That, as you say, 50% we don't charge, but the ones that have breached, I know they quite often go for another planning application, but couldn't we charge a bit extra? Because I presume this enforcement costs us a lot of money in officers' time, because they normally have to go back quite often.
So if somebody submits a retrospective planning application, then they pay the same application fee as other applicants. And the planning application fees are set nationally by the government. And every now and then the government does talk about increasing the fee for retrospective applications, but it would be a deterrent. And actually, I'm all in favour of retrospective applications because it helps regularise the matter, and it puts the person who's carried out the development in the same position as all other applicants. They have to go through that stressful and expensive process of submitting a planning application, and then the neighbours get an opportunity to comment on it. So if we serve a planning enforcement notice and the person wants to appeal to the planning inspectorate, then they have to pay double the fee. So they do pay slightly more at that stage.
George.
Hi, yes, your report was very helpful, actually. I found it very interesting. My question is about when there are large developments, and within my ward, Barking Arborfield, obviously there is lots of development going on, making sure that things happen as they're meant to within Section 106s. And I'm not so much talking about the district centre and that lot. That's, everyone wants to have that done, and everyone's sort of holding developers to the fire to get that done as quick as possible. But it's things like little green spaces, little play parks, that type of thing. And I have a particular green space in Finchwood Park that has been frustrating me. So my question is, do you recognise that there's a challenge there around getting these spaces delivered in a timely manner and to specification? And what are you doing to try to resolve that, particularly with these sort of big developments that we've got going on in such as Arborfield Green?
Yeah, thanks for the question, George. It's an ongoing issue, and sometimes in areas where developers are due to manage space going forward rather than the council, it can be even more problematic. So the planning process puts in place conditions or Section 106 obligations that require an appropriate level of management. What we do with the resources we have is seek to ensure that they comply with whatever thing we agree, whether it's a management company or whether it's something that we're doing. If I'm honest, no planning department I've ever worked in 40 years has ever had sufficient resource to ensure that all the planning conditions and all the Section 106 requirements get adequately complied with. Possibly if you're in a national park, which is pristine, you do get that. So it is an ongoing problem because it's an area of our work that is non-fee earning. So we have compliance officers, but we've got a limited amount of resource. I've written 1 or 2 letters to developers in the last year to get them to comply, going all the way up to the managing director, reminding them that if I'm brutally honest, that they'll probably have another planning application in our area, and I don't really want to receive the same kind of concerns that you're dealing with. But that's about as far as we can go, unless there is something of an extreme issue, which is non-compliance on a planning condition, then we can take a little bit more action on that.
Yeah, it might be quite useful if I send you a couple of bits that I've been looking at as just examples, not looking for any necessary action, but where there's been a failing on an obligation within a 106 for a developer to do something, but the triggers are maybe a little bit vague and make it a bit complicated. So I might send you a couple of examples, and maybe we can have a chat about them another time.
Happy to receive them, George, and have a chat.
Any other comments on the excellent report? Can I actually ask? I think this would be a really useful report to send to all members. I think it's an excellent report. It's clarified some points to me, and some interesting things in here I hadn't actually quite connected together. So I think this would be an excellent report sent to all councillors for them to benefit from it. I think it's a really good report. And nice and short. Thank you. Oh, I'm sorry, Mary Louise first, and then.
Yeah, keep pressing it, then it doesn't work. In support of other committee members who've spoken about, the high quality of the team and planning, but I'd also like to, the few planning meetings that I've appeared, I've actually kind of felt quite concerned for the well-being of some of the team members, because I feel that the way that, particularly in the last, this extremely adversarial situation is being allowed to develop, where people are, harangued, sworn at, whatever. Maybe this is just sort of part of the deal, but I really don't think it should be. And I think there should be some way of of protecting the well-being, and also maybe changing the terms of the discourse, that this is no longer, acceptable. But I was genuinely, I've worked in quite a lot of war zones, but I was genuinely struck by the horrible atmosphere in some of these meetings.
Yes.
And I recognise that it's emotionally very important to people, but it was quite extraordinary.
I just wanted to come in and say you're absolutely right, Mary Louise. The atmosphere can sometimes be pretty poisonous in those meetings. People feel very passionate about things, and sometimes I'm afraid they don't exercise the kind of restraint that is necessary if we're going to have a quasi-judicial process carried through in a proper way. And it can be quite intimidatory at times. Now, elected members should be able to look after themselves and recognise they have a job to do, and they must do it. And they can answer back. But of course, our council officers can't. And it is, to me, totally unacceptable that council officers should be put in that position. And I agree with you entirely that we perhaps need to make sure it is clear, going back to comms, what is and what is not acceptable in that kind of forum. Because those are very long meetings. This has been a fairly long meeting, but by planning committee standards, this is a real shorty. Planning committee can go on a long time, can go on for 4 hours at times. And it's intense pressure on the officers and the councillors involved. Pauline served on planning. She will remember what it's like. I've served on it, as I said in my introductory remarks, for a very long time. It's mainly a highly pleasurable and intellectually challenging environment. And I've enjoyed most of the planning meetings, but there are some that really it has not been good. And I have to say, this has been a long-term problem. It's not just a recent development, but perhaps the tendency to let loose and not hold back has grown over the years. And I think it's undesirable, and it's quite wrong when it's directed at council officers. And I hope we will find a way of addressing it.
Great. Thank you very much for that. And thank you for the question. Anything else from anybody on this report? Are we happy just to note it and thank you for, as it's a really good report. And if that can be sent around to all members, I think they'd all benefit from the contents of it. So thank you very much indeed. And again, you are more than welcome to stay till the end of the meeting, but I fully understand.
It's highly tempting, but I think possibly not.
We won't take it personally. Thank you. Right, homeward stretch. A couple of items left on the agenda. The next two are about appointments to two task and finish groups. One is on active travel, one is on litter bins. This is really a call for names for anybody else that wants to come forward. I wasn't going to debate it unless you want to put your hand up again. Could be done now. Sent to Liam.
Liam, for the active travel one, if you make it me and Peter Harper.
Sorry, Caroline. Mary Louise. Thanks.
Yes, I would like to go back on the active travel and put a plea in for people, more non-semi-professional bicyclists on that one, because I think we need a range of people like myself who are extremely nervous cyclists in order to get the perspective of people who need to be encouraged, and the litter bin as well. And possibly if you're in the need for another member, because I know that the litter bins it wasn't particularly popular. We might be able to find, I can't think why.
That's a rubbish thing to say.
My lonely crusade for musical litter bins will continue. So yeah, I can, if I could put my name down for both of them, and then depending on the litter bins, I can try and find someone else from the Labour group.
Polly.
So I'll have to come back to you on litter bins because it's more difficult, but highways one's okay.
What I was going to say to this is, if we can send any names back, rather than kind of bouncing anyone into it, just send the names back. Liam, if you can kind of collate those and then let us know. I'm still trying to figure out what's non-semi-professional bicycle. Is that people who don't wear lycra?
Well, yes,
That's fine. Yeah, you should, for sure. You should definitely be on that group if you keep falling off it. Thanks for that. Just send the names into Liam, and then we'll try and make sure there's any other gaps. And it's great to see those people coming forward. Right, thank you for that. Moving on, work programme, which should now be reflective of all the changes that we've been making over the last couple of meetings. If we're happy to note that. The point I wanted to make from this is the next couple of meetings are going to be busy. As we go through the budget, the next one for obviously is looking at adult social care, budgets, economic development strategy, and the town centre strategy. And then you can see how the rest of them roll out over the next couple of weeks. Everyone happy to note? Determined to bring this in under 2.5 hours. Action tracker. Anything to Liam from your side? Are we happy to note? Great.
One thing. They're just on. George? I'm trying to find it, but maybe you can answer the question. I know the Barkham Ride group, the sort of management group that was going to be set up, that was marked. I think Charles Margetts mentioned that it had been marked as actioned, but it wasn't. I'm trying to find where that is in here now. Was that unactioned?
Yeah, that's on page 192. I've lost it now. Near.
Okay, so it's now it's ongoing. That's cool. Okay, thank you.
Anyone else? No, happy to note. Great. Thank you very much. That's it. Thank you for all of your participation tonight. That's under 2.5 hours. Getting there. Hopefully the next ones will go through. Any other comments on the budget papers to see once they get circulated, send them back in, obviously sooner rather than later as the meetings are soon. Thank you very much. Meeting closed.